Welcome to everyone from the Center for Global Christianity and the School of Theology. I'm Dana Robert, and I have the great honor today of introducing our speaker, the Reverend B.J. Stiles. Before I do that, I would like to thank Albatross, Ted Carp, and Dean Moore, without whom B.J. would not have been able to spend this month with us doing research here in the School of Theology Library. So thank you to everyone. B.J. Stiles will speak to us about Motive Magazine, Methodism's icon, and Albatross, a very intriguing title that, I shouldn't philosophize about your title. I'll wait and see what you say. But let me just introduce B.J. B.J. is a social activist, a United Methodist minister, and in the 1960s was the award-winning editor of Motive Magazine. Motive Magazine was an avant-garde magazine published by the Methodist Church that combined politics, art, social commentary, and theology in a creative way that hasn't been seen since. So Reverend Stiles was editor of Motive during the very important and tumultuous 1960s. In 1968, he took a leave of absence to join the staff of the Robert Kennedy for President campaign. After the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, B.J. went to South Africa for a period of time and then returned to launch the Kennedy Fellows Program in Washington, D.C. Following that, he worked with the Urban Institute and under the Carter-Mondale administration was deputy chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities, and for 3 years directed NEH support for state humanities councils. In the 1980s, as the AIDS epidemic was beginning, Reverend Stiles resigned his positions to work full-time in private-public partnerships, advocacy work, and assistance for persons experiencing that epidemic. He stimulated an impressive array of public-private sector responses to the epidemic that led in 1987 to the founding of the National Leadership Coalition on AIDS. In 1999, B.J. Stiles retired and relocated to San Francisco, where he has continued to be engaged in a variety of healthcare and philanthropic initiatives, including HIV/AIDS, breast cancer, and women's health. And we're very pleased to see him sojourn among us to do research in the School of Theology Library on the history and legacy of Motive Magazine. With Albatross's leadership, we are working to restore the memory of the Methodist student Christian movement and some of the things that it stood for. And B.J. Stiles is an important piece of leading that restoration and reclamation project. So join me in welcoming Reverend Stiles.
Dana, if my adult daughters were here, they would chime in and say, we keep asking Dad, what do you want to be when you grow up? Given the hodgepodge of vocations and engagements that are represented in Dana's gracious introduction, I'm hoping it's pretty obvious. A, I don't plan to grow up. And I hope that every future activity will be as rewarding and challenging and almost as diverse as have been all of my ministerial and post-ministerial activities. I wish to join you, Dana, in expressing thanks to your colleagues, not merely for the invitation and the support, but for adjusting your plans and your hospitality for my being here at all, and my being here to share some experiences with you. Just a short time after I heard from Ted Carp that the School of Theology might be interested in bringing me on campus for a while, I had to adjust because I didn't feel very confident that even with reflection and dexterity that I had much of any significance to bring forward. But I thought that's a good excuse to put you back in the library where I have not been for far too long. As my excitement and anticipation grew, I had to accept a very surprising interruption in my life. In early February of 2011, ironically the week of my 78th birthday, I received dual diagnosis of 2 concurrent highly malignant cancers. Well, that's enough to really take your mind off your troubles and think about what am I going to learn and how do I become prepared to accept this intervention in my life. I'll cut it short to say that in hindsight, God interrupted me yet one more time, and did so in a way that gave me an opportunity to think more deeply about my work, my relationships, and my career, and to spend some of that time dwelling a bit more seriously about, if I have more time on this earth, what difference do I make? And what are my priorities, and do they happen to be God's priorities? I'll leave it to you to conjecture whether the answers that have come forward are adequate answers to those questions. I am grateful, I'm relieved, I'm thrilled that my healthcare conditions of the last 2 years have been successfully resolved, and that I have enough stamina and energy to be amongst you, not only to do some work in the library, but to share in these reflections. There is so much about Motive Magazine that resists being confined to a central theme or a consistent continuity in its 40-plus years of history. But there is something that I wrote in my editorial in February 1968 that, for me at least, tends to capture the central message. It's a quote from an editorial, a quote from one of John Kennedy's last speeches, which was delivered on the campus of Amherst College in October 1963, a few weeks before his death. The quote is, "The men who create power make an indispensable contribution to the nation's greatness, but the men who question power make a contribution just as indispensable, especially when that questioning is disinterested, for they determine whether we use power or power uses us. Our national strength matters, but the spirit which informs and controls our strength matters just as much." If you will join me just for a moment for an invocation. A line from a wonderful hymn for all the saints who from their labors rest, who thee by faith before the world confess. We give gratitude for all who have come before us to celebrate, share, provoke, and invoke. And we ask for humility, humor, and guidance from those in this community who are the saints of tomorrow. Amen. There is a metaphor that has come forward within the last decade, which is adapted to just almost any activity one could call for. It's called finding and using one's own footprint. And the footprint mostly seems to relate to ecology and the environment. I'm going to take liberty to share for hopefully a moment or two my religious footprint. I grew from a farm boy born on a farm in Texas at the depth of the Depression to become a troublemaker very early in my life. I can thank and be grateful that the sources of my troublemaking were in fact the Methodist Church. Without the opportunity back in those dark ages to enjoy the institutions called the Methodist Youth Fellowship that led into the Methodist student movement, I'm not quite sure whether I would have envisioned the world that I have tried to occupy for the last 70 years. Why? Among the attributes and genius of the Methodist Church as I came to know it were the escalating levels of structure that enable segments of the church to conspire and associate with colleagues at conferences and workshops and seminars and an endless array of study books. I learned very quickly as an early adolescent that beyond my own local church, there was a district, and then there was a conference, and then there were national structures, all of which created opportunities for us to engage in conferencing. The cliche in the United Methodist Church in recent decades is called holy conferencing. I don't know that we experienced the terminology back in the 50s, but in hindsight, they were truly holy. These were remarkable moments in which to meet peers and colleagues, and most of all, to be exposed to men and women from a world vastly different from the parochial community in which I was born. In my early high school years, in a high school that didn't have a gymnasium and therefore we didn't play basketball, the only sport known in the community was football. So every Friday night during football season, the community gathered to push, corral, celebrate, and go behind the bleachers and drink beer. I had the great opportunity to twice leave the state of Texas to go to a national conference, the first being a conference of the Future Farmers of America in Kansas City. I don't even recall the date. I remember the train ride, I remember Kansas City somewhat, and I can't recall a single thing that I heard or learned, except that I returned to my chapter and said to my sponsor, I do not want to grow up to be a golden future farmer. Who was more disappointed, my FFA sponsor or my father? We survived it. But in 1948, I heard about and wanted to attend the National Methodist Youth Conference in Cleveland, Ohio. And my church raised the money to pay for my registration fee and my travel, and I rode the train to Cleveland. Inevitably, when one goes to a conference, you come back to your group and you have to, quote, make a report. I gave a report to my local congregation, and mouths were aghast about what I had to share, what I learned. And afterwards, I was taken aside by the elders of the church and severely cautioned, no, reprimanded, for accentuating the things about the conference that excited me. First of all, it was completely interracial and multiracial, and I openly spoke about celebrating the conference with other Methodists who were Negro. I concluded that by saying that the wonderful New Year's Eve service, in which there were lots of bishops presiding and other important aspects of liturgy, the musician of the evening was an incredible tenor named Roland Hayes, one of the earliest African-American tenors in the Metropolitan Opera. The thrill of hearing such a voice and hearing it from someone from New York City, from the opera, absolutely brought an understanding of what the world beyond Texas held for me if I pursued it. I felt called to become a minister. Now, in the 1940s, early 1950s, in my sheltered environment, that only meant that you were going to be trained to be a missionary to be sent to China, or you'd be a preacher boy. And if you were a fairly successful preacher boy, you could go up the ladder with a 4-point rural charge and a pastorate. I didn't really feel inclined to want to be either, but I never imagined what my options might be. I was offered a scholarship to go to college, a small parochial Methodist college in Fort Worth, attended by at least one other person in this room, Mr. Hart. I went to that college on scholarship, which depended on my learning enough typing and shorthand to take a job my first year in college as a secretary to a female boss. I think I learned more from that first year experience than I remember ever learning in any of the classes I took. My summary is that to go into college as a church person, as a Methodist, wanting to get a degree and hopefully an education, I was really uncertain about career objectives and outcomes. Throughout those 4 years in college, however, it really was the student movement which became my laboratory and my training ground. Going to my first UN Washington seminar, I had free time in New York, and again, drawing upon my childhood experience at the Cleveland Conference, I wanted to go to the Metropolitan Opera. I didn't know anything about opera, I didn't have the money for tickets, but I went and I bought a ticket to the 5th tier standing room only and stood for the entire performance of Aida. No elephants, unfortunately, but some awfully wonderful voices. We also were guided in our tour to visit the Museum of Modern Art by none other than Albert Barr, the director of the Museum of Modern Art. And when we got to the closed room for Picasso's Guernica, I knew I had encountered an insight into the world that I would not have otherwise gotten, verbally or by reading. The painting is so enormously creative and impressive that it carries its own energy and its own dynamics. I saw Picasso with my only prior exposure to art being Warner Sallman's Head of Christ on the wall of every Sunday school in the church. I didn't quite know what to do with the copy that I was given when I got married because I couldn't imagine hanging Solomon's Head of Christ above my bed. And I didn't. College was a grand opportunity to begin to grow up and to continue to think about the worlds beyond. End of college neared, and the selection and the decision to go to seminary and pursue a degree in theology, regardless of what that might mean in terms of career. I was puzzled because I learned just enough to think that there was a lot of wisdom way beyond the state of Texas. And so in thinking about options, I actually considered Boston University School of Theology. I also considered Vanderbilt. Kind of thought about Union, but couldn't imagine how I could cope with New York City. And then I realized from my student movement experience that the growing faculty and dimensions at Perkins School of Theology really matched some of my career expectation. After all, Albert Outler was there, Merriman Cunningham had just arrived, John Deschner had just arrived, and a host of people who were remarkably aggressive about their vision for theology, their experience with the church. And so I went to Perkins. And toward the end of Perkins, I still didn't have clarity about what next. It was pretty clear it wasn't going to be a missionary to China, and I certainly wasn't going to voluntarily do the 4-point charge. 3 months before graduation, Nashville called, and the head of campus ministry, Heil Bollinger, said, "We've been talking about you, and we wonder if you might be interested in moving to Nashville and taking a part-time job at the Board of Education and checking out the PhD program." Astounding. Who could have ever imagined that me, a 25-year-old, not yet graduate of a seminary, would be invited to become part of the staff of a general board? And so we moved to Nashville. I was still naive enough to think as we drove out of Dallas in our U-Haul truck dragging behind us that I was going east. Well, Tennessee is east of Texas, but the folks in Nashville prided themselves on being the Athens of the South, and in fact had built an exact replica of the Parthenon, albeit it was in concrete and stored with junk. Nashville, where I lived from 1957 until departing in 1969. It was really a cauldron of the excitement and frenzy of the late 50s, early 60s. The magnificent thing about the physical building of the Methodist Board of Education is that it was really the center construct of a group of institutions, and yet we were the only one who had a refectory and cheap food. Mostly because I'm sure Dr. Gross wanted employees not to go away for lunch. That would take too much time. But our refectory became a place that the faculty of Vanderbilt would drift over to, students and visiting professors at Scarron College would come. It was really a mix of outside people, mostly church, but not exclusively, and gave many of us an opportunity at coffee breaks, lunch breaks, watermelon tasting, etc., to interact with other people with broader experience. Equally important and influential in my personal life is that my former wife was a very active participant in community theater and joined community theater in Nashville, and it was very avant-garde, so avant-garde that after productions there would be a visiting coordinator to keep the audience, and we would have a dialogue about what did Gibson really mean, or why did Tennessee Williams write so depressingly? Most of those coordinators were people like Joe Brown and Lady Love, people who understood theater, deeply rooted in religion and theology, and very, very eager to translate what we had seen into the experience of the audience. My first 2 years at the board, within a year, I and my senior advisor readily agreed I was not a PhD candidate, and I transferred to the history department and pursued a master's degree in American social and intellectual history. I then started full-time employment. It was very interesting that the third editor, Modi, Jameson Jones, was also employed there, even before he became editor of Modi. And Jamie and I would carpool together into work. We'd arrive at the board, walk down the hall, and every secretary, all female, of course, mostly Caucasian, of course, would all greet us coming down the hall. "Good morning, Jamie, how are you?" "Good morning, Dr. Stiles, how are you?" After a couple of times down the hall, Jamie said, "Why do they call you Dr. Stiles? I'm getting my doctorate." They're just fiddling around with a master's degree. Let me hasten to say a bit that I learned then and in the year following, when Jamie surprisingly announced his resignation to move to Garrett and become a professor. This decision was announced in late May Dr. Gross called me into his office, and I was not accustomed to one-on-one discussions with the General Secretary of the Board. Dr. Gross looked at me and said, well, as you know, we have a real problem on our hands. The publishing year is coming up, Jamie's leaving us, and we need somebody to get in there real quickly. We need to keep the circulation up, and we need to keep the magazine going. We didn't have time to do a national search, so we're inviting you to become the acting editor of Motive. I thought he was interesting. Took the news home at night. My former wife, who normally would deal all with my harebrained ideas pretty patiently and a good listener, immediately looked at me and said, well, why would you want to do that? And I said, why do you have such a negative attitude about Motive? Joe, no, Motive is wonderful. But you, acting editor, you couldn't be acting anything. I thought about it, went in the next day and thanked Dr. Gross for the invitation and said, it's really not wise for you or the board or the readership or me to put someone in to be acting anything. It's a critical position, it's an awkward time. You need clarity, you need leadership, you need fresh commitment. And he said, I think those are good points. Let me talk to my colleagues. Next day he came back and said, well, if you want to be editor, the job's yours. I had spoken with only one other person, and that person was Margaret Rigg. And I'm thrilled that this university has her archives, that you have framed and are exhibiting a lot of Peg's artwork. Peg I had known quite well as a colleague in the campus ministry work, and I knew the magazine well enough to appreciate that if there was a new editor, that human being had to be in lockstep with the magazine's history in the arts and to be an equal colleague with the art editor. So I told her of the invitation and said, he's invited me to be acting editor, but I'm going to turn him down. And Peg just almost jumped out of her chair. How exciting. No, you should not be acting editor. The magazine needs creativity and a commitment, and you're the right person to do this. Wonderful. If I take it, will you stay? And she made the same agreement with me that I had made with Dr. Gross. Will you give me 1 full year of mutual commitment, and if it's the wrong decision, we'll get on with it. I said, will you stay for at least a year? And she said, of course. I think we'll make a great team. So at age 27, I became the 4th editor of a magazine that for 7 years I had held as the epitome of what being thoughtful, creative, determined, and open-minded as a church person might be. It was my teacher, it was my companion, it was my inspiration. I learned as much as I possibly could about the real history of the magazine. And I'll dash through this very quickly. When the 2 northern and southern branches of Methodism in the mid-1930s moved toward merger, there were a series of meetings, 2 of which were conducted by the heads of the northern and southern campus ministry departments, specifically for college-age students. One 1935 and one 1937. The outcome of both meetings were the students were demanding the creation of the Methodist student and the foremost product should be a magazine, a periodical that would aspire and inspire the student movement. Not only did the founding brethren agree to do this, they put up $4,000 as a subsidy for the magazine. I checked it out. 1939, $4,000 today would be $65,000. Do I know of any Methodist denomination structure at this point that would find $65,000 lying around to send to anybody? No. It was an investment. It was an exciting development. The early issue, the first issue was February 1941. On the first page of the first issue, Harold Arensberger wrote, "This magazine is written for you who have faith and also for you who doubt. If creeds and institutions have clouded rather than clarified your vision, then motives still may probe behind the face of things to seek the broader, deeper meanings that are valuable in life. This magazine seeks truth, no matter where the search may lead. It is not afraid of labels and symbols. It feels that the church as an institution has a chance today that it has never had before, that the success or failure of the church will depend largely on who and what its members are." Take heed, my friends. Those are important words, and I feel just as relevant in 2012 as they were visionary in 1941. And just to set the record correctly, within a year, 2 articles published in the magazine created such consternation and brouhaha in the Methodist Church, in particular the Methodist Board of Education, that it was determined that at the next meeting of the annual meeting of the Board of Education, there would be a hearing to consider the relevance and the future of the magazine. The ties with Boston University go back to that era, because the then president of the Board of Education was none other than Bishop G. Bromley Oxnam. And Bishop Oxnam put forward a plan of inquiry. I love the delicacy of what an investigation was going to be about. And comprising the committee of 12 were 6 bishops and 6 Methodist college presidents. Now, in 1960 terminology, I would have been a little skeptical about 6 bishops and 6 Methodist college presidents being overly permissive. Bishop Oxnam wielded his power carefully. The first bishop to speak was Bishop Francis McConnell, known to many of us better as the father of Dorothy McConnell. Bishop McConnell made an eloquent speech, the record testifies, and in the record concluded his speech by saying, "Freedom of speech has its corollary, freedom to read." Another bishop spoke, and then another bishop called for the question. The record says that there were 140 members of the Board of Education. My God, how did they afford such a people? 140 members voted. The outcome was the ratio of 6-1 to continue promoting the magazine. Hallelujah, thank goodness. Let's get on with the story and with the job. It was really, however, prescient, because that's really the history of the magazine. I think with the exception of the 3 years of Jamie's editorship, Motive and its editor or editorial staff were hauled in front of the bureaucracy of the church frequently to explain itself, to justify the expenditure of personnel and money. And the implication was that if you don't straighten up and behave a little better, we may be looking for a different staff. Twice in the ensuing years, in fact, it was more explicit. One of my colleagues, late in the Ortmeyer editorship, was actually fired because he sat in at Vanderbilt University Divinity School protesting the ouster of Jim Lawson. The head of the Divinity School and the head of the Methodist Board had a quiet consultation, and my colleague was invited to pursue jobs elsewhere. Simply put, the magazine has always had its freedom to try, to risk, to articulate, to probe, to bring into the dialogue with the campus students and the campus ministry an array of issues, an array of points of view. It's really astounding to me now, while here, to sample a few of those early issues, and in the first year and a half, to realize how often the pages were devoted to articulating the position of pacifism. Now, up until 2 years before, the majority of voters in this country had vigorously opposed going into war and were barely tolerant of American support for Britain throughout the bombing. How amazing that a church-sponsored magazine would not only actively present the theology and the sociology of pacifism, but would actually print instruction manuals on how to become a conscientious objector. Even in the 60s, when many of my colleagues were sorting out ways to go to Canada to avoid the draft and escape responsibility for the Vietnam War, I don't think it ever occurred to me and my editorial colleagues that we would give them a handbook on how to escape to Canada. Just by that time, students were ingenious enough to try to figure it out themselves. There were many other aspects of motive in those early days that are fascinating. A student editorial board of 37 college and university students, one of whom just happened to be Paul Dietz Jr., so he had a tie early on. And there was an editorial advisory board, Earl Morlatt, George Harkness, etc. And another cooperating advisory council, G. Bromley Hodgson. The era of the 50s was an era in which I think motive escalated into the characteristics that guided me as a reader and subsequent issues. Although Motive has always been known as a magazine of the arts, equally visible and probably far more pages were devoted to mission and missionology than any other single topic in the life of the magazine. Motive in the arts, let me summarize briefly. There were significant amounts of space devoted throughout all 4 editorships to various aspects of the performing and visual arts. In the 40s, it was mostly theater, literature, and film. But nevertheless, the artwork in the magazine was still chosen and adapted from major museums. Roger Ortmeyer brought a more aggressive commitment to the visual arts, and maybe most importantly, in the second year of his editorship, got a letter from a young theology student in Richmond named Margaret Rigg, who wanted to know if she could do her student internship at Motive magazine, and needed an answer from Mr. Ortmeyer early for the director of placement. I have copies of most of the exchanges between Peg and Roger in that period of time. How remarkable that she, as a very young seminarian, filled her pages full of what she was learning in her courses on Barth and Bonhoeffer and ethics. Here was an artist who wanted to understand as much of the Bible and as much of current theology as possible. Her stamina, her determination, her creativity was shared by her colleagues Robert Hodgel and Jim Crane. Thank you, Ada, for arranging for our visit to Tampa and the opportunity to meet Jim Crane and to interview him about his history of the magazine. Let me get quickly to my tenure. In 1960, I think we were all so perplexed by the rapidity of social change throughout society that it was puzzling to quite know where the real thinkers were and what to make of them. I'm gratified as I have now touched every page of every issue I edited to see the frequency with which we've heard and read from Harvey Cox, Nathan Scott, Van Hardy, Carl Michelson, a huge array of some of the most articulate and vigorous young theologians. I thought about Harvey Cox's frequent and imaginative contributions to motive, particularly an essay he wrote on Miss America and the Cult of the Girl. This preceded his interview with Hugh Hefner in Playboy magazine. I mean, no one truly equals Harvey Cox's audacity. I felt much later, in 1998, when I was in Atlantic City for the Miss America pageant, that I should call Harvey and say, Harvey, the Cult of the Girl isn't quite so deleterious as you wrote about it, because I'm here supporting Miss Illinois to become Miss America. Because Kate Schindler's platform issue was HIV/AIDS. And the excitement of having a beautiful, straight Miss America addressing the rest of this country about stigma and discrimination of that disease. Irresistible. Let me quote really hurriedly from a letter Peg Rigg wrote in 1962 after being commissioned to design the window for the chapel in the Westminster Fellowship at the University of North Carolina. Peg wrote about her beliefs and her vision as an artist who is also a Christian. The window does not tell a story or even a picture of a symbol. In this window, I want to present the light that shines in the darkness, or the light of the world. It is a presence, not a story, and anyone who enters this chapel is called upon to enter into a relationship. We artists must do our work as a service, as a meditation, as a plastic prayer. If the artist and art itself is to survive and mean anything in the spirit of science, art must once again become capable of being a service, which to me means a constant rediscovery of who I am as a Christian. I welcome any contemporary description, confession, testimony of a practicing artist about what it is in their life and their value system that they are wishing to express and communicate. Hurriedly, a couple of bullet points about the issues I edited throughout the 60s. Long before the tragedies and horrors of the Vietnam era held center stage in our lives and in the pages of the magazine, we persisted in exposing our readers to the war in Angola, the spreading violence in Central America, the anguish of Cuba, and the struggles for human liberation present everywhere. And these were not just journalistic human interest tidbits. Many were probing the theological and spiritual grounding of the social, political, economic, and sexual considerations pounding us for attention and comprehension. In January '62, we published the only English translation in the U.S. of the keynote presentation of the All-Christian Peace Assembly held in Prague in 1961, Theology in the Era of the Cold War. The struggles for civil rights and racial justice were expressed in mind-boggling detail and fast-paced frequency. An interview with Huey Newton, probing the examination of his foundation and leadership of the Black Panthers. I don't quite know how my bosses put up with that. Frequent contributions from Jim Bond and Vincent Hardy and many others we celebrate. We work diligently to be ecumenical, occasionally multi-faith, and in dialogue with counterparts around the country. Studs Terkel, Ramparts Magazine, Sister Carita, Michael and Karen Bob Nowak, Will Campbell and his colleagues in the bold and charismatic Fellowship of Southern Churchmen. In my 8 years, we published at least 7 special issues, double issues devoted to a single topic. First one on mission, December 1962. Second on peace, October 63. Third, psychology, psychotherapy, and religion. I don't remember the date. The election, 1964, which bound in the special issue of Christianity in Crisis, which analyzed and vigorously opposed the election of Goldwater. An issue on film, November of 66, and an issue on technology in 67. And yet the standout in my memory then and now was the double issue, January, February 1964, on death. I mention it because we were a publication for students, young adults, teachers. Death was not something that necessarily was very thoughtfully addressed by anybody at that age. The death of a grandparent, of course, was difficult to deal with. The theology of the church was abysmal on the subject of death and the hereafter. We puzzled over that topic for at least 3 editorial years and could never get to a point that we felt we had something bound between the pages of the cover of the magazine that was relevant, defensible. We were in final page proofs in November 1963 when President Kennedy was killed. We did not change a word. We only added a 2-page spread, which was an adaptation of Howard Moody's sermon at Judson Memorial Church. It's hard to recall all that felt and meant to us and to our readership. Soon thereafter, Motive became a target for extraordinarily interesting secular journalism. Time magazine looked us over in 1966, as did Newsweek and the Wall Street Journal, etc. We won every award in the Association of Church Press until they finally appointed me chair of the awards committee so that we could no longer compete. I really wanted and needed, however, the excitement and the stimulation of being associated with journalists and editors of non-religious, non-Christian, non-church publications, and so I took a membership in the Magazine Publishers Association and went to a couple of seminars and entered their competition. And in 1966, we were the only magazine that was a runner-up to Life magazine and the Magazine of the Year award. All of this, I look backwards against my title. I think there are many icons that come from this storytelling. The biggest treasure, however, are the 24 plus people I interviewed prior to my year of illness. Former staff, contributors, readers, others. They jumped at the opportunity to talk about what Motive meant to them then and now. It was amazing to me how alive the impact of the magazine still is. Most confess that in fact in their attics or their basement there are boxes of old magazines which they simply could not throw away. Any number of whom also said, hanging in my home or in our apartment or condo or the cartoons of Jim Crane, The Prodigal Son by Robert Podgill, the work of Peg Rigg and Sister Carita. How rewarding to hear from people in 2011, 2012, former volunteers in mission, current faculty, some still active as college chaplain, speak of something that is so musty and less driven in the library that has such bearing and relevance still in their life. By early 1968, I was so preoccupied with the condition of American society and the terrible state of American politics that I didn't know how to cope adequately. I turned down two very outstanding job offers. First, with Harper and Row to move to New York to become book editor for the religious books department. 3 trips to New York, the last of which was to actively explore housing, schools for our children, etc. And the night before, my then wife said, "So, what have you decided?" And I said, "I don't know." I got up, had my coffee, and walked into Mel Arnold's office, and he had paperwork for me to sign. And said, "So," and I said, "Thank you, but I'm not coming." And he said, "What have we failed to do? What's missing in the offer?" I said, no, it has nothing to do with you and your offer. I'm not finished doing what God called me to do. The WSCF invited me to consider moving to Geneva and becoming the communications officer for the World Student Christian Federation. Interesting, provocative, exciting in a sense. I'll think about it. I came back and had a working lunch with a very dear national friend, John Siegenthaler, close to Robert Kennedy, and told John that I was offered a job to move abroad, but I didn't want to take it. And he said, "What would keep you here?" I said, "Well, that's really simple. If Bob Kennedy would run for president, I would jump at the opportunity to be a participant in affecting the outcome." And he said, "Well, can you put your decision off for a few weeks? I think you might hear some interesting news." So I went back to my desk and wrote my editorial, Wanted, Hope for the Future. And it got picked up and reprinted in the New York Times. Kennedy made his decision. He came to Vanderbilt to make the second speech after his announcement. And Siegenthaler invited me to his home for a beer afterwards. We met. Hours later, Senator Kennedy finally showed up. And Siegenthaler looked at me and said, "Would you go to the kitchen and get me a beer?" "It's your home, John." Okay, so I go back to the kitchen. And there is Senator Kennedy alone, standing at the kitchen bar. "Well, Siegenthaler says you're the guy who wrote that editorial." "Well, yes, sir." And he said, "Look, we don't have a lot of time here. I've made my decision. Are you ready to make yours?" To do what? "We need people like you in this campaign. We are really up against it." And I had resisted the pleading of all of my friends to join the McCarthy for President campaign. I admire Senator McCarthy, along with Senator McGovern, and please say a prayer for George. But I didn't feel that in '68, anyone other than Bob Kennedy could really confront Lyndon Johnson effectively enough to present the voters with real options. Anyhow, I said, okay. 2 weeks later, I negotiated a leave of absence with no pay. My family had given me permission to go on the campaign trail, and I worked the primaries in Indiana, Oregon, and in California on that dreadful June. When I got to each of the campaign states, not really knowing much about how to organize for a presidential campaign, I said, what am I supposed to be doing here? In Indiana, the guy said, get a crew together to go out there and put all these leaflets on the windows of all those cars out in the parking lot. Look out at that. By the middle of the afternoon, the police had come forward saying, where did those pamphlets come from? It's illegal to put campaign literature on the parking lot, in the General Motors plant. Get your volunteers together and go pick up all that stuff. What I did figure out is that in every place I went, I knew a lot of people. How did I know them? The student movement, the Methodist Church, the contributors to Motive magazine. My legacy was my homework and my opportunity. In Indiana, the chair of the McCarthy for President campaign, Bishop Jim Armstrong, highly respected Methodist bishop, liberal. So I called him up and said, hey, I'm in town, but I'm working for the other guy. If you have any suggestions about people who are undecided I might approach, please share. And he said, yeah, it would be my wife. Here's her phone number. She's begging to get involved in something other than the McCarthy campaign. It repeated itself over and over and over again. At the time after the assassination, I simply was paralyzed, incapable of thinking clearly or positively or optimistically about anything. Phone call from the Board of Missions. Would I go to South Africa and look into the economic boycott in South Africa? Ironically, I remembered that in fact it was the Board of Missions in 1945 that invited Harold Ahrensberger to go to India to consider the roots of nonviolence. I went to South Africa, met Derek Kotzel's parents and family, and toured a number of places where Bobby had made eloquent speeches. When I got back, I went to the Chicago Democratic Convention, August 1968, as a registered reporter for Religious News Service, and found myself arrested and in the Chicago jail because I was at the wrong place at the wrong time. It was a rather eminent group of cellmates, and we all kind of took it cavalierly until about 3 a.m. in the morning, and we couldn't breathe. The amount of tear gas infiltrating the non-air-conditioned windowless holding cell just felt like this is Dick Daley sending us a message. I had a brief experience of what it is like to be incarcerated, unwelcomed, and targeted by police, to be harangued but not persecuted. Eventually, I was called before the judge, asked if I was represented by counsel. No, I'm not. And he said, there are volunteer lawyers in the courtroom if you would like counsel. And I turned around, and there sat about 150 young lawyers from the city of Chicago responding to their membership in the Civil Liberties Organization. I pled guilty, I got a mild sentence, I paid a small fine, and I went back to Nashville, and 2 weeks later resigned. I knew I simply did not have the capacity to try to pick up and lead the magazine creatively. And so I submitted my resignation and said, my resignation is effective January the 1st, or sooner if you find the editor you want to hire, and sooner if I find a job. From there, the next 25 years of my ministry have been secular, and I have had careers in Urban Institute, the federal government. In 1982 comes the HIV epidemic became visible. I was scared, I was vague. I kept looking at myself in the mirror saying, what can you do to help? And finally I realized I shouldn't do anything for anybody else till I dealt with me. And I quit my job. I ended a 25-year marriage. I came out of the closet and I spent the last 25 years of my career deeply engaged with Ted Karp and a few others in the efforts to reduce the stigma and the discrimination associated with HIV. I'll wrap up by saying, when I left Nashville in 1969 to go to work for the Kennedys, any number of my then colleagues said, well, are you going to voluntarily locate? What are you going to do? And I said, I'm going to do what I've been doing since ordination. I'd like to carry my credentials to the Baltimore conference and become special appointment in Baltimore. So I wrote a rather, I think, detailed, non-accusatory letter to the then bishop, Bishop Lord. And after a few weeks, a two-sentence reply. We have no openings in our conference at this time. Best wishes, John Wesley Lord. Some colleagues, Alan, of ours over in your division of the Board of Education said, well, don't give up. I said, I'm going into secular appointment. I'm not quite sure that it's relevant for me or the church for me to continue my ordination. Well, don't give up. Well, what do you think I did? I said, no, why don't you consider California, Nevada? Well, I live in California, I'm going to live in Washington, D.C. Why? I said, well, because that's where Bishop Charles Golden is the presiding bishop. Charlie had been across the street from us at the Board of Evangelism and I knew very well. So I wrote him a quiet letter saying, I'm thinking of trying to find a hospitable church home. Several have suggested California and Nevada. I'd be most willing to come out and meet with the ministerial committee, with you, to discuss the pros and cons of this. He wrote back and said, no meetings required. Send me your credentials. Would you meet with the ministerial committee before this year's annual conference? When I officially retired from that conference 6 years ago, having not really kept alive very many personal connections and being affiliated only with Live Memorial Church, in California, Nevada, there's a ceremony in which each retiree is called forward. A colleague in the conference makes a statement of appreciation and then hangs around your neck a retirement symbol. And a district superintendent whom I've known casually stepped forward to be my advocate and gave an introduction almost as glowing as yours, Dana. And I was startled, honored, and overwhelmed. So I bent over to receive my medal. The entire conference stood in a 5-minute standing ovation. I then realized that what I had said to people earlier, no, I'm not leaving the church. The Methodists or any, I'm not leaving. I feel like the church has left me. And it's now up to me to find my way in the world to be a minister at large and to continue to advocate on behalf of peace, justice, and equality. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Any who care, there's a bound volume of Motive on the coffee table. You're welcome to look at it.
We have some time for questions and answers and comments. Yes.
My name is Ross Terrell. I wrote a few articles for you in the late 60s.
Yes.
Haven't seen you since. Absolutely fascinating to hear your remarks. My question is really about your early points about Methodism and the associations. I had a similar feeling growing up as a Presbyterian in Australia that the local levels and then the various other levels and the particularity of these denominations had something to be said for us. So my question is, did we lose something when the ecumenical tide dissolved all that?
Definitely. I mean, certainly, I think in the student movement, as the Methodist student movement merged into the University Christian movement and then eventually into an even more quasi-secularized identity, we lost our place in line. If you were Methodist and you were part of the Methodist system, you pretty much knew what the structure was about, and you were given some rights to advocate and credentials to do that. I think, however, that for me and many of the leaders in the student movement, we were finding it claustrophobic, and we were also finding that the paramount issues that the denomination seemed to be dealing with were not really out of the roots of culture and not conversant with other parts of society. So, as I suppose in other traditions, when you vacate a place of some degree of authority and security, you undertake risk which may be overwhelming. And certainly in the 60s, the lack of organizational, institutional hospitality and resources elsewhere were just not existent. There may have been additional alternatives which we didn't think about, i.e. becoming completely commercial, going to a circulation-based, advertising-based point of revenue. If there were predecessors in the religious world that had done that, I'm not aware of it. It's the tension between known risk and unknown risk that you can't predict and don't know for sure that you have the resources to undertake. Thank you for coming. That's Hey.
I want to ask a question that may be untimely or unfair, and if it is, just set it aside. To ramp up to it, thank you so much for what you've brought. It's a thrilling story, and I appreciate it. My parents met on the train to Cleveland in 1948, so I have a vested interest in what you've brought.
You owe a lot to Cleveland.
I do. One of my mentors, when I came to Boston University, gave me 2 boxes of magazines, saying he was the chaplain at Colgate. Bob Hamill, your predecessor at Marsh Chapel, kept me in the ministry through his columns and writings in Motive magazine. We at Marsh have an e-magazine now titled Motives in honor of what you did. I want to ask, speaking of death, a final question. Can you say in what terms, in what rooms, by what voices Motive died? In other words, how did it end? At whose hand?
It had a terminal disease after my departure, in that the student leadership of the movement wished to go outside the denomination into an unaffiliated, independent status. And so there were 2 years of further publications of Motive, edited by a team of people. They also refused to have a hierarchical structure, like editor, etc. It was in their tenure that the enormously controversial issues on homosexuality, separate issues for and about lesbians, and separate issues for gay men. Had the magazine remained under the umbrella, certainly of the Board of Education, as it existed, and I suspect any other agency of the church, I think the magazine would have been killed and the staff terminated on the spot. I don't think there would have been a hearing of an inquiry. I think that the energy of the magazine in my successors was so antithetical to the bridge we kept trying to cross between theology and the church, and I think the issues that were uppermost in their experience and perhaps in culture, the issues that were uppermost were really the secular issues post-Vietnam and in conjunction with the numerous organizations for liberation, domestic and otherwise. I suspect, however, even had the magazine survived in some form as a print publication, I think technology would have simply overcome it as a print publication, and whether it could have become the non-print vehicle of communication, I don't know. That would have been part of the risk to have been taken. There was an effort in the Board of Education a few months after my departure. They convened a committee on transition. There were some meetings held about what was needed. Most of my then staff had remained in place for a few months, and there was an effort, series, I think, to continue the magazine, but with a different flavor and new leadership. Two of the members of that transition committee have told me, however, that the meetings were abysmal, that the sponsorship by the board was claustrophobic, and that the feeling was, it's dead, let's get on with it. I want to hear on Sunday when we interviewed Jeff Green. Peg Rigg, after she left in '65 and joined the faculty at Eckerd College, Bob Hodgel, Jim Crane, and Peg Rigg became locally known as the motive faculty at Eckerd College, formerly Florida Presbyterian Church. Peg was invited back to Nashville, whether with some other people or only, but she was invited back to talk about picking up or retweeting the magazine. And I've kept Peg's 3 letters telling me what that discussion was like. And she really was offended and astounded that they would even ask her back to talk about how to make it work. In simpler terms, I think we'd all burned out. I think we felt we had given the most we had to give, and there just was not the internal creativity and stamina to think about how to keep enduring the abusiveness of the church. I mean, it was ferocious. To go to a board meeting or to go to a parish, to stand in front of a congregation, to be subjected to their epithets was considerably demanding. I wanted to do it because I felt accountable. I wanted to present a face of the magazine that wasn't, I didn't have a beard and I didn't wear sandals, so how communistic could I possibly be? I should have taken more, I should have looked more carefully at my colleagues in the civil rights movement, at John Lewis and others who were subjected to far worse physical violence than I was ever subjected to, about how to remain both nonviolent and forgiving. Both lessons I don't think I scored too well on.
I want to pick up on that. May I ask you a frivolous question first?
You may ask any question you wish.
This, you're going to resolve a bet between my brother and myself. You dated my babysitter 5 houses down from me on Yucca Street in Fort Worth, Texas. And my memory is that you had a green Thunderbird. I mean, my brother's memory is you had a green Thunderbird. My memory was you had a green MG, which became my favorite car ever. Who wins the bet?
You both lost.
My memory is the MG, but it's not true.
I wish it were true.
But it was Yucca Street, right?
I-
In Fort Worth, Texas, near Amon Carter Riverside High School.
Oh, yes.
Yes. And
David.
she was my babysitter.
No,
And I think that's the moment of the 25 years, is that correct?
just about.
Yes. Here's the, I want to thank you. Motor Magazine was very meaningful to me growing up in Texas and in college. And I particularly appreciate your introducing me to Bill Stringfellow, who became a lifelong friend. And I really learned about him through Motor Magazine. But I'm interested in where we go, where did the spirit of Motive Magazine ever emerge again in the United Methodist Church, if you've seen it? Considering all the things you've just been talking about, have you seen it in other places? Has that spirit emerged, perhaps in Sojourners, or where would you see it emerging today? And is there any place where we need to pay attention and support and help something flourish that you've seen and are aware of?
Even before arriving here, I was so astounded and honored that an institution like BU School of Theology cared, particularly cared enough to not only value your bound copies and to welcome with open arms and resources the estate of Peg Rigg and hopefully some of the rest of us. It had, as I say, my secular jobs had taken me so far away from the environment of the Motive student movement community that it was on the back burner. It was way back on my mental shelves. What I feel about being here is that most of the answer to your question is right here. It's in this room, it's in this institution, it's in terms of how you, hopefully, with support and participation by me and others, I could entice in. It's how you wish to protect the legacy. You're doing it magnificently through the digitalization, which you intend to do in order to make everything completely accessible without cost to any and everybody who wants to use it. That's such a rich resource and a huge investment. Thank you. It may be that part of the answer lies in a bit more convening and bringing together a few people. Ada has found some remarkable alumni of the MSM and Student Volunteer Movement who are pleased about this activity. But maybe that there's a little more conversing, communicating to be done to ask those questions. I personally feel that we are so far into non-print communication that I feel it would be somewhat wasteful to speculate about resurrecting a print magazine. It could happen, but it would take resources of significant amount and better spent elsewhere, in my personal judgment. But the the vehicles for interactive communication are just simply so accessible and exciting that I don't know what it would be called, I don't know how it would be shepherded or financed or coordinated. But there is an audience and there's a community out there ready to participate. So I guess I'd try to simplify and say I'm very optimistic that you're doing much more than just celebrating a legacy. You really are exposing yourself to helping to construct a better answer to that question. Your resources are thin, the demands on your time are enormous, but see what the investment of just a handful of you has created. And my 24 interviews, with no exception, they are saying, please keep us posted. Please tell me what the next step is going to be. Please share what you learned with us. How we organize that and who the we is or are, I don't know. But you're on my bucket list for 2013. And up until this time, my family has been saying, BJ, what do you want to do in 2013? I want to come back to Boston.
So we have time for another question, Dr. Tom Garage.
Vijay, when you went to the Methodist Student Movement Conference as a young man, you found yourself exposed to diversity of all kinds, right? Now that came because Methodists from other parts of the world were there, or what was the diversity like?
Most of the conferences I attended in the 40s and the 50s were attended mostly by American college students, most of whom were Methodists. But if I read further about the planning for the second National Methodist Student Conference in 1942, there's a long paragraph about the necessity to recruit and make visible men and women from other nations, other races, other cultural groups. And I think with no exception, there was at least 2 or more keynote speakers. Philippe Maury from Geneva, D.T. Niles from India. I mean, the leadership of these conferences truly understood the importance, not just of diversity, as we now use the terminology, but presence, and presence of men and women who were not Americans, deeply engaged in their faith, deeply engaged in humanitarian and social activism, so that the dominant participation group, the dominant audience, were Americans.
Now, to follow that, was that movement attached to World Student Christian Federation in any way? Because this is one of my complaints.
Yes.
If you take my complaint.
Good for
When you
you.
have a student movement for this country, without contacts with the World Student Christian Federation, you lose a lot. I mean, most of us in third world countries are all linked to that one. So we already are within an international circle. So there's a lot of going back and forth. Here, now of course, even if you have a Methodist student conference, you have people from all over the world. You have students from all over the world in this country now. So but not linking to international organizations always kind of impoverishes, I have a feeling. I don't know why the student movement didn't think of being in links with World Student Christian Federation, which has changed people like me. I mean, the student Christian movement meant a lot to people like me when I was growing up in India. But that was the WSCF.
Well, if you look at who attended these series of meetings in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, the biggest agenda by the mid to late 20s was in putting African Americans and Anglo Americans, or black and whites together. That was a really urgent issue because of the sense of hypocrisy that you're sending people abroad to convert people from other countries, and yet there's segregation and prejudice and lynching and all of that in the U.S. So that was one piece. But then another piece is inviting international students who were studying in the U.S. That's how they got international students at some of these conferences in a cost-effective way. They were paid, their way paid from whatever college they were in.
That really is reflected, thank you, that's helpful, and it's reflected, embodied in the issues of motive right at the end of World War II and right afterwards. There are numerous articles written by Germans who had fled Nazi Germany by way of England, France, etc., who wound up in American universities, colleges, most of whom were here on paid scholarship. Many of the funds were raised by students in the Wesley Foundation. So there was in the leadership of the Methodist student movement an activism that sought camaraderie with non-American peer group students who were fleeing violence and Nazism, etc. And the pages are full of fascinating evidence of that. Young women from EY University talking about life in Korea. So it was multinational, somewhat. But when you are truly a minority, surrounded by the culture and the English-speaking language of other people, it's difficult to really be clearly understood.
Because I attended conferences where Indians, Pakistanis, and Sri Lankans come together for a conference. I attended as a college student with students from Sri Lanka and Pakistan.
Thank you.
I was thinking something similar, although you've added the global dimension much more probably than I was thinking. But the Methodist Church and the United Methodist Church were becoming increasingly diverse during the same period that Motive was undergoing these major changes. And that affected the way the ministry of the general boards and agencies could be done. A lot of things were pulled back and done in more safe ways during that period from 65 to 80. And it also affected things like hymnals and other things. Coming to a consensus about bold vision became more challenging. So I wonder if that is a phenomenon that needs to be studied, especially given your call to us to seek that vision that might be pulling us now. That's a question. I have, on another subject, I have a comment. I have a name for this online journal that you just did.
Ooh, wow.
Courage.
That's really exciting.
And-
Mary Lou, I don't know how to analyze the transition in the United Methodist Church and the politics, participation in and politics of the General Conference. I mean, the most recent one was so frustrating, complex, and disappointment that I'm bewildered about how UMC will adjust in preparation for the next General Conference. And then the vitality of UMC really is, for the most part, in terms of metrics in Africa and the Philippines. we don't quite know how to accommodate that.
Just a little PS, not just that, that phenomenon, but between 1970 and 2000, some dramatic shifts took place. So in that 1970s period, at the same time Motive was undergoing these dramatic changes, the United Methodist Church was undergoing some major changes in its doctrinal statements and so on. So it would be worth studying what was going on there. What were the multiple forces at work there?
Among the most impressive positive changes in the UMC is the role of women and the degree to which, with no exception, the jurisdictions are electing really credible, impressive women to become bishops. And I detect, as I went to the celebration of life for Bishop, the African-American woman who recently died.
Leontine
Leah, yes. When I went to her memorial service in San Francisco, the representatives from every other jurisdiction who came there on behalf of the jurisdiction, the majority were female. And when they described how she lost the election to become a bishop in the southeastern jurisdiction, and within hours money was raised to send her to the western jurisdiction where she was elected. It's really how the vitality and diversity and role of women in the UMC has now reached a level not just of equality, but of major leadership. If our denomination, since our denomination has made those adjustments progressively and successfully, maybe we can climb other steps faster and better.
Join me in giving a round of applause.